Yeah.
Okay, so it's 7 o'clock, and I'm really excited for today. We have an important conversation, and actually, we've titled this conversation Calming Conversations About Communicating Across Cultures. Now, I cannot take credit for that brilliant title, full of alliteration. That was all Valda. And let me tell you a little bit about our very special guest, Valda Boyd Ford today. And Valda is the CEO of the Center for Human Diversity. She is a cultural competency expert and an accredited speaker. Over the past 30 years, she has worked in 57 countries with such a variety of different groups. Listen to this. She's spoken and worked with CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, tribal chiefs, Afghani teachers, and even Buddhist monks. I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about that. That must have been an interesting experience.
Yes.
And also, using her skills as a registered nurse and public health expert, Valda built a thriving high-tech home health and supplemental staffing agency in North Carolina, employing 200 nurses and techs. She developed the first cardiac, stroke, and physical rehabilitation center in the Caribbean. She created the center, as I talked about, the Center for Human Diversity in Omaha, Nebraska. And of course, she is a much sought after keynote speaker and workshop facilitator. So Valda, thank you so much for taking 30 minutes with us today.
My pleasure.
So because we only have 30 minutes, why don't we just dive right on into it? Because this is a very, very deep and hot topic right now. So what would you like to cover first? Would you like to talk about how sometimes we can be afraid of saying the wrong thing, or do you prefer to talk about the fatigue as an educator? We want to get to both those points.
Okay, let's just start off with our fear of saying the wrong thing. One of my most requested keynotes is on the paralysis of political correctness. And as we have now what we're calling cancel culture, where everyone is so afraid that if they say the wrong thing, they may lose their standing, their home, their livelihood. And I believe that we need to do a better job of thinking through the fact that anyone can say the wrong thing. And many times it's out of what my great-grandmama always called simple ignorance, meaning that you don't know. It is not your intention to not know. It either hasn't come up before, or you have no idea of the impact because no one has told you, ooh, don't say that. Maybe you've been around people who are not comfortable with correcting you if you're saying things that are wrong. And I just think that when you're paralyzed like that, then you stop the conversation altogether. You can never get to the next stage if you're afraid to talk.
That's so important. You're right with this cancel culture. It's something else. We've seen it even, I know that in the United States and of course in Canada, the same thing is happening. And we have to be allowed to make mistakes during this very difficult time, because it's, even though this movement has been going forward since forever, it's time that we speak up. And there's something that people are afraid of doing, and it's the silence. How do we break? Do you have any steps for us on how we can break that silence and that fear? Because you do say the cancel culture, so it's on our own part to forgive other people, but how do we get over that fear and that worry?
Well, I think it's important that you think through having someone who can help you if you're really afraid, if you really have been sheltered, if you have not had the opportunity to be in company of people who are different from you, who pray different from you, who think differently, then find a safe space to go to learn. That can be, today, you can just surf the web to find allyship. Find a place like in the United States, the YWCA has always been into anti-racism. There are many different organizations that specifically are there to help people understand how to work across cultures. They're usually great organizations associated with universities, since they have so many international students or international teachers. And there are just so many opportunities. But even if you just know one person who you consider to be different than you, but here's a key point, they might not feel that they're different from you. I know people will say to me, why do Black women always? And I say, well, why is it that you're asking me about Black women particularly? Why don't you start with, I saw something the other day and I wondered about, instead of you're automatically putting me potentially on the defense by saying, why do Black women always? Well, is it that it's only Black women who do this, or only Black men, or only blonde women, or only overweight people, or only people who are certain religions? Or have you just seen it in the one? Because when we see difference, many times we also see deviance, and we don't recognize that we're overloading the weight of whatever the word is or the conversation because we consider there to be a difference. And if I may give an example,
Yeah.
I taught at several universities, and I had a young East Asian student who came to me in tears because when she did something in the clinical area, the instructor said, you Asian women have to stop being so meek and stand up for what you need to do. Now, this young woman, number one, was not meek. Number two, she was a third generation East Asian American woman. So she didn't even understand what she was talking about.
Yeah.
And number three, the instructor, being in a power position, was one she felt unable to have the conversation. And so that meant that she felt that she was being stereotyped and wondered how much of an effect it was having on her and her future livelihood.
Yeah, that's something else. And I think that we all need to stand together. And if we hear something or see something like this, because a lot of us will see an unfair situation such as that, or witness it, or hear maybe even from that student, and we'll think, oh, that's awful. But we need to start standing up and using our voices and speaking out.
Right. And in her case, as I said, she was the vulnerable one in the situation.
Yeah.
Being that she was a senior near graduation, she didn't want to rock the boat so much that she would end up without her career. It became my responsibility to go speak to the teacher. And not only did I speak to her, I took it upon myself to speak to all the teachers and for us to get together to have a round table to talk about some things that we might be saying that we might not recognize might be hurtful or harmful. And it was interesting. But the approach was, I had this situation come up and I wonder if we might have a moment to talk about it, instead of, why would you say that to that woman? I mean, you made her feel terrible and meek and she's wondering what else you're thinking about her. It's all about starting the conversation. And I like to say to people, when you talk about being afraid or fearful, if you're having a conversation with anyone, your best friend was not your best friend to begin with. Maybe there were things that there were differences or some commonalities that brought you together or got you talking. But now that you're best friends, it still might mean that if you want to talk to her or him about something, they might not feel like it right then. They might not agree with you, but it doesn't mean that the relationship is not going to survive. If we could take all of the demonic diversity out and just think about, here's a person, I want to have a conversation with this person. I have to also make sure it's the right time for them to want to have a conversation about something that's sensitive. And if it isn't, then they say, I'm really weary since this Black Lives Matter thing has been going on. People have come to me as if I'm an encyclopedia or Mr. Google, and I am just worn out. Could you just give me a day? Or let me give you a couple of things to read up on or check out, or a couple of videos to look at. And then let's have a discussion when you have some framework. And that's okay. The person who's trying to be an ally should say, oh, yeah, I get it. You're tired. They shouldn't say, well, I was trying to be an ally and you won't even talk to me right now. I see that, sometimes.
So that's part of that whole fatigue of being educated or being the educator. Talk a little bit more about that. You must be getting completely worn out, because you're probably even more sought after now in these times.
I've been pretty busy for quite a few years, but now it's pretty overwhelming. There are times when I just think to myself, why do you even need to ask me that question? For instance, if someone comes up and they want to talk about the issue of a noose. We had an issue here in the USA where Bubba Wallace, a racer, had what looked like a noose hanging in his pit. Well, whether or not it had been there forever, as some people say, or whether or not it was some kind of thing that you lift an engine up out of a car, the question is, why was it only in the one pit where the black driver was? And even if it was there from last year and it wasn't intended to disturb him, why was anyone using it? I mean, why? But even if it was a simple error, no big deal. You just have a conversation. And if someone says, well, I don't understand why this is a big deal, be willing to listen to why it is a big deal instead of saying, oh, you're just being so sensitive. I mean, that is the deal breaker right there for me when I'm having a conversation with someone and they just don't get it. It's fine that they don't get it because I might not get them, but to tell me you're too sensitive, you need to get over it. Because I've had things like, I was giving a workshop once in a rural place, very small town, but I'd been brought out to try to get some work done. We had a really great 4-hour discussion on race, cultural competence, unintentional bias, unintentional racism, how to develop safe spaces. And it must have gone well because at the end, there were a lot of people standing in line waiting to talk personally. And that's good. But I was looking at a woman who came to the very back of the line. So there were about 30 people standing there. And every time someone would come behind her, she would say, no, you go in front. No, you go in front. No, you go in front. So I'm trying to have a conversation with the people right in front of me, but I'm really paying attention to what is going on back there in the corner. And why does she want to be last? And as a speaker, you know, sometimes it's because they're going to say things that they really hope no one else will hear, that God knows no one else should hear, or that it doesn't come out of their mouths. I didn't know what to expect. But by the time she got to me, she was a frail white female. Oh, she said to me ultimately that she was 80 plus years old. And when she got up to me, she said, may I touch your face? And I thought, I haven't had this request before. And I was in a place where I was the only one who looked like me, being the person who was talking about race and culture. And the people who were my handlers who had brought me in for this conference were all going like, and they had that look like, oh my God, there's Edna. What is Edna about to do? And so they were coming to usher her away. And I said, no, let Edna come on up here. And I said, Miss Edna, go ahead. And so she took her hand and she put it on my face and she slowly just ran it down. And then she took it away and she said, and turned to walk away. And I said, oh no, darling, you cannot leave with that. So she came back and I said, well, what was the point? What is it that you wanted to know or discover? She said, this is my first time ever being around anyone who looks like you. And I wanted to see if your skin felt like mine. And I said, well, what do you think? She said, well, it feels just like mine. Wow. And I said, no, it doesn't. And then my handlers were like, oh no, she offended Valda so much that now there's going to be a rumpus going on. And I said, no, your skin is fine like silk. It has beauty of living well. And I know I can see that glow in your face where I was watching you all day where you were taking things in. And so she was satisfied with that. But what happened is it gave us the opportunity to recognize that a safe space had been created. And even though she didn't approach me in a way that would be typical, and everyone was being paralyzed by her behavior, like, oh my God, she wants to put her hand in the woman's face. We felt that I was going to allow her, or at least not scorn her, for doing something that she needed to do for over 80 years.
Wow. That's beautiful. And I love that you talked about a safe space. And I think that's really important is when you have those questions to find that safe space, especially in this cancel culture that you were talking about. I'll bring something up a situation in my family that I didn't understand when they kept saying the phrase white privilege. Mm-hmm. And I really didn't understand that because I grew up in an economically challenged area of my community. I didn't feel privileged at all when I was a child. My father was an alcoholic. We didn't have a lot of money. And so I thought I wasn't privileged. I've worked really hard. And so my daughter, Lindsay, who recently got married, and she married this wonderful Black man. We were having a conversation. And I said, I don't understand like the privilege part. And at 28 years old, so smart, she said to me, well, if you think about you growing up in that neighborhood, if you were in that neighborhood with somebody who was Black, you would get more privilege, possibly. Mm-hmm. And so in that moment, I understood what the phrase was. And I thought, okay, I can get this. And so I think that's the key when you have a question, to find that safe space and have a discussion. So I think it's really important not to put all of the onus on someone like you, who's a professional and expert, the CEO of the Center of Diversity, and do some research and really try to learn. And that's what I've been doing in this process, even preparing for today. I've been trying to learn. And one of the things that I mentioned that we talk about is unintentional racism. So what is unintentional racism?
Well, in order to get to that, you have to first get to what racism is. And I think it's a word that's misused very frequently. If you're looking at the continuum of how we feel about people, we can start off with ethnocentrism, where it's my way or the highway. I'm an American, American's better than Canadian, or North Carolina is better than South Carolina. You just get into that. And typically it's kind of lightweight. And then you go to next, which might be bigotry, where you decide that whatever you believe is better. And I kind of don't want to be around you because I'm better. And then you get into racism, which is not only do I not want to be around you, but I'm going to use my power to keep you from having what I have. And that's the distinction between discrimination and racism. And I can say racism, homophobia, misogyny, any of those, genderisms, all of those, but it's when you use your power. So unintentional racism may be that you have the idea in mind that you are better, whether it's because you're thinner, taller, different color, different religion, you have more money. And then you intentionally keep someone from having what you have. Mm-hmm. As a registered nurse, I have seen many times that there are people who are less comfortable with having men in the nursing profession. That has changed over the many different years that I've been in. But I've seen times when admissions people might keep men from getting into the school without even really thinking about doing it. They just had decided that this was for women. And if you were a man coming into it, you must be gay. And therefore, we must protect the world from a gay male nurse, which, anyway, who cares why you're there if you're a compassionate person coming to help? But if you are doing it, it can be unintentional when you haven't said out loud, men do not belong in this school. But if your actions, that can also be structural or systemic racism, where your actions happen, institutional, that's what I want to say, institutional racism, where it's not your intention, you haven't sat down and had policies and procedures that say, we will not admit this group of people, but it happens anyway, because no one questions the fact that that group is not getting in. Or there's the rare one, the token person who's in, so you can feel like, oh, well, there is a man in the 500 class of nurses, so obviously we can't be biased against men. This is unintentional racism, where the climate is such that no one is saying, hey, do you recognize that when you say these things, they're hurtful to a particular group or potentially to someone in this group, that you are actually keeping people from being in place. And let me give you an example. In the US, we've had what we call affirmative action laws or affirmative action policies. And that is that we're supposed to try to make sure that the environment is reflective of the demographics of the society. So if they're 13% African American, 15% Hispanic, 2% Asian, then the workplace needs to look kind of like that. But because it wasn't, and because segregation was so strong for so long in the USA, then there were people who tried to look for people who were not of the majority in the population. And so it started to feel like there were quotas. And some people, unfortunately, in the workplace did look for quotas. Well, we need to have 5 women. We need to have 5 men. We need to have 5 tall people, whatever the case might be. But there are 2 systems of affirmative action. That's big A, big A. That's the policy side that I was talking about. And then there's small a, small a. So as you were talking about privilege, if you lived in a neighborhood, even though you were white in a less privileged neighborhood, but your parents hung out with some wealthy white people who, when they said, oh, I want my daughter, Denise needs a summer job, can you help me out? And they were like, yeah. That's that affinity thing. I know you, I know your kids, I'm going to vouch for you, I'm going to let you in because I feel comfortable with you, more comfortable than I do with someone who's Muslim or Jewish or etc. And so that is the thing where you can be unintentional. And if no one is willing to stand up to say, and perhaps you don't recognize it, but this is the end result. It might not be what you're trying to do, but this is the end result. And if we look around and everyone in our room looks exactly like us, prays exactly like us, thinks exactly like us, then we have not done a good job of opening up and thinking about our privilege. And that is the privilege of knowing someone who you feel comfortable with, who you uplift along with you.
And so much of it we know has to do with fear. You're talking about power, and that all comes from fear.
Mm-hmm.
So I think go ahead.
There are a couple of things, like when we talk about fear, even if we're talking about talking and being fearful of what we say, a good friend of mine, Joel Shanker, says there, when he starts to think about race and issues of diversity, then he likes to think about the difference in mud puddles and landmines. So if you think about it, if you step in it, right, let's just say, if you step in it, isn't it better to step in a mud puddle than a landmine? But if you think about talking about diversity as such, that it's going to be a mud puddle and not a landmine, go ahead and take the step. If you get mud on your feet, then hopefully you have a friend there who will say, here's how you can get it off. Or here's how you can avoid stepping in it over and over and over again, as compared to if you're like the bull in the china shop, you don't know, you don't care to know, you don't believe that you have privilege, you don't believe that, or you do believe in the myth of the meritocracy, that just because you work hard, you study hard, etc., there are no differences in your opportunities, then that's a landmine. And if you intend to be ignorant, that's not simple ignorance, that's just ignorance. As my great grandma would say, you just ignorant. And so if that's what you do and believe and never change, then that's a landmine, because you're showing you have no desire to learn any different, to be any different, to think any different.
I love that. That's such a vivid analogy. Everyone can picture that. Now, Valda, what would you, in the best world, as you are giving your message during webinars like this or on the world stage, in the best world, what would you like to see? What would you really want people to walk away with going, I know?
Yeah, I like to look at the fact that if you start off thinking about every person around you as just a potential friend and not as a definite enemy, we are trained from birth to have these layers put on us. We don't even recognize it. If your parents grab you up, if a stranger comes, then you start to become afraid of strangers. Your parents need to teach you to be smart enough to not walk into danger, but they have to be intentional about saying, if you don't know someone, then let me be there when you meet them, not don't ever talk to anyone ever and always run away. If there are times when you are the only one, then think through what it feels like for you. I like to use the analogy of, if you've ever been on a sports team or wanted to play on the field, whether it's soccer or softball, tennis, and you were hoping to be picked for the team, and you were always the last one to be picked or the one never to be picked, that would hurt. But if that was the way you felt every day, or if you wondered every day, that the difficulty of racism, prejudice, and bias is that the person who is feeling it may wonder, because they've been conditioned to, am I not getting this because of the way I look, the way I think, the way I pray? And if you are the person who has the opportunity to reach out, think about why you are or are not reaching out. Have you been so conditioned to be afraid of anyone who doesn't look like you don't even give them the opportunity to get to know you? And that's a shame, because there are a bunch of great people in the world. But if we've already put up barriers, then we never get a chance to experience the full wealth of what the world has to offer.
That is beautiful. And I've just give a couple of minutes. We have 5 minutes left. And I just wonder if anybody has any specific questions for Valda. And just to let you know that people are saying that they're loving your examples. I think I have the comments off onto a private chat. So many people are loving what you're saying. And okay, so Lynn Wade is asking, can we have uncomfortable conversations in safe places? And I think that's what you were talking about, that we can.
Absolutely. You can have uncomfortable conversations anywhere. You can have an uncomfortable conversation with your spouse, your lover, your best friend. The point is, are you willing to say, that doesn't have anything to do with who the person is? It's just that it was uncomfortable. And are we willing to say, okay, bad time, I approached it poorly, can we talk about it again? And let me give an example to those who want to be allies. I was working in a few different countries, doing a lot of work in refugee camps, and I was putting my foot in a lot of mud puddles, and sometimes they felt like landmines. So when I got to the third refugee camp, I was in Sierra Leone, after having been in Sri Lanka and in Ghana. I thought the best way to do it would be to go up to the young man who was over the nonprofit that I was working with, to say, look, if I say something wrong, if I do something wrong, I don't want to offend you. Will you please tell me? And what he said to me was, let me tell you a story. There was a man who was on a boat on a river, and he lost the oar. And then the water got to be white, and the boat was moving towards the rapids. And he thought, oh my goodness. So he got out and he tried to swim to the shore, and got there, and he pulled the reeds and they broke. He tried that over and over again, and he knew that soon he was going to die. And he said, one last time, God, please help me. And he tried and he tried and he tried. He got to the shore, and when he got there weren't reeds to grab, there were swords, and they had double edges. So no matter what he did, he was going to be bloodied. He might end up losing a hand, but it was the only chance he would have to survive. And so he worked his way, bloodied and bruised, onto the shore. And he said, now do you understand why I can't tell you? And I said, no. What is this story about? He said, the double-edged sword is that you're here to help us, and you're here to bring me something, or I want to get to know you. And if I tell you what I really believe, because you have power, perhaps I will lose that opportunity for your goods, for your services, or even for your friendship. So just like any relationship, if I say nothing else, just remember that it's work. It's hard work. And no matter who is your best friend, the love of your life, your parent or sibling, there have been moments where it's been different, but you thought of them as someone equal to you and worth the time to come back around, and you didn't demonize them on the front end.
Wow, that is absolutely beautiful. And on that note, you have spent 30 minutes with us, and you have a busy night ahead. Thank you very much, Valda. Greatly appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, and thank you.
Oh, and one last thing, if you want to reach Valda, please go to www.valdaford.com. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.